Adab, and a very good afternoon to one and all present here. A 10 miles and a couple centuries afar, in time and space where we are seated today, a poet by the name Mir Taqi Mir exclaimed, Patta patta boota boota, हाल हमारा जाने है, जाने न जाने, गुल ही न जाने, बाग तो सारा जाने है. You see, when Mir was trying to suggest that every leaf, every shrub is well aware of his conditions, and might be that the flower does not know, but the entire garden definitely knows what he is going through, he somehow resonated the anxiety I today share in the task of introducing this lecture and its speaker. As it is always the case, the unsaid looms large over of whatever is ever said. That said, were I to still make an attempt, I am immediately reminded of my dear friend and a study circle member, Ananya's reminder that when a handful of first-year undergraduate students of Delhi University thought of doing something together in December 2018, it was far from an endeavor to build an institution. The country and the world was facing predicaments without many precedents. A handful of undergraduate facha friends, as we call them, facha being an interesting mixture of the terms bacha and first years, then found it imperative to read and write with each other on issues they considered pressing. Coming together for the reading sessions at the bustling Delhi School of Economics canteen was then an avenue for friends to bond over oily noodles, oily dosa, the inimitable masala coke, and the unparalleled chicken rice. Now, none of the members then could have ever envisaged that last year, on the 14th of December, the Sankrityayan Kosambi Study Circle, a Delhi-based student-run organization, completed 5 years of existence as a collective. At a time when the spirit of collegiality is undermined like never before, a politically committed, public-facing collective like ours has been able to successfully forge a democratic culture from scratch. To remember is to reflect together. To remember is also to remind ourselves. Satyam J, a dear friend, was a first-year undergraduate student of history at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, who unfortunately succumbed to COVID-19 on May 25th, 2021. In his short life, he demonstrated exceptional clarity of thought and a political sensibility that was rooted in his firm commitment to socialist solidarity and mutual aid. An eclectic reader and avid debater, Satyam was deeply interested in literature, translation, and progressive politics. As a member of the Sankrityayan Kosambi Study Circle, Satyam contributed immensely in the short time of his association with this collective. His incisive arguments and observations during the reading sessions and his superb translation of Rahul Sankrityayan's essay, Dimagi Gulami, for the Lokayata blog testify to this. In the days before his demise, Satyam tirelessly volunteered to help people affected by COVID-19 as part of several student-led help desks, arranging hospital beds and oxygen cylinders at moment's notice during odd hours. A remarkably compassionate individual, Satyam has left a lasting imprint on the lives of his friends and acquaintances with his sharp intellect, rare humility, and warmth of character. Today, on the date of what would have been Satyam's 22nd birthday, we at the Sankrityayan Kosambi Study Circle remember and cherish him through this annual lecture held in his memory. The first and second memorial lectures were delivered by the historian, Professor Marcus Rediker, and the philosopher, Professor Akhil Bilgrami, respectively. We are honored that to deliver the third Satyam Jha Memorial Lecture, we have with us Githa Hariharan. Githa Hariharan is an author and editor. Her first novel, The Thousand Faces of Night, won the 1992 Commonwealth Writers Prize. Since then, she has published many texts including the short story collection, The Art of Dying, the novels The Ghosts of Vasu Master, When Dreams Travel, In Times of Siege, Fugitive Histories, and the collection of essays Almost Home, Cities and Other Places. She has also edited A Southern Harvest, a volume of stories in English translation from 4 major South Indian languages, and with co-editor Shama Futehally, the collection of stories for children titled Sorry, Best Friend. 3 of her novels have been nominated for major awards, including the Booker Prize, and in times of siege was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers Prize. Hariharan's work has been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, Greek, Urdu, and Malayalam. As she herself somewhere once said, and I quote, "My voice is a medley." The study circle could not have hoped to hear a better medley that encapsulates our varied but united spirit, effort, and camaraderie. I am also pleased to inform you that we were supposed to have Professor Apurvanand as the chair of this talk, but unfortunately, due to some medical issues, he couldn't make it. And in his absence, very kindly for the study circle, a historian of great prowess, and very proudly I can say, a teacher of mine, Dr. Naina Dayal, has stepped up to the occasion, and she would be chairing this session. So without much ado, I now pass on the mic to the chair of the session to take the proceedings from here on. Thank you.
Should I just invite Githa to now take over and deliver her lecture?
Thank you so much for having me. Let me begin by describing what I hope we can do together. I'm hoping to share some conversations that tell us something useful about the self, but more important, about connecting the self with the real world in which we read and write and live. A conversation, I've said. So who am I speaking to? All of you, of course, and the authors and texts and translations I want to share with you. But the starting point of the conversation is speaking with Satyam J, speaking to his interest in learning more about literature, translation, and progressive politics. It is from this starting point that I want to share some of my own learning with all of you. Suppose we begin this learning exercise, these multiple conversations, with the question, what happens when the individual writer steps out of her little room to journey in the real world? To address some of the possible answers to this question, some scenarios which help us to fill the big picture of possibilities this question summons, we need to talk about learning literatures in the real world of India that we live in, past and present. And while not ignoring the self, going well beyond the self, expanding the self. But let's step back a little. The starting point is always the backstory of the self, the unforgettable backstory all of us need to acknowledge, but not be hemmed in by. We enlarge the world of the self as we map it onto community, to language and languages, onto cultural details, from food to dress, music to poetry, to custom, to place, class, caste, generation, and much more. This core self, this starting point of each of our lives, can be a burden we carry all our lives, to be shed again and again like molting skin. It is also the wealth we carry all our lives, malleable, thank goodness, so we can grow. The self is the deepest layer in our heads, even as we grow beyond it, even as we learn to become a citizen of a bigger world. A citizen of the larger world, I have said, and this citizen is a citizen, let me emphasize, whether acknowledged as one or not. These citizens, so the self and the other, all are located within our own world, what writer Nayanthara Sehgal calls that glittering aspiration called India. So what are the facets of this glittering diamond? The myriad facets give voice to the old, rich word we need to learn afresh every single day. diversity. Then the fault lines, old and new, manifesting themselves as divisions, exclusions, old and new. The diamond is a jewel for some, a blood diamond for others, for far too many. And always, there are also the facets that guide us like perpetual lamps, the struggles to resist these divisions, work for inclusion. As this cluster of aspirations, this cluster of ideas we call India, translates into practice, how do diversity and divisions manifest themselves in literatures and cultures? That question takes us to the reading and writing of literatures, the learning experiences of the reader, the writer, the citizen, across diverse constituencies, across divisive histories, past and present. Learning experiences that test existing knowledge, stimulate new questions, facilitate the acquiring of knowledge of the real world well beyond the self and its riches, its limited received wisdom, its stereotypes and prejudices. Reading opens more windows every day, and writing allows us to look at these multiple views more closely and in all their complexity. What I really want to do is share some recent learning experiences of mine through a forum I was part of, the Indian Cultural Forum. The Indian Cultural Forum was set up in 2015 to discuss issues of concern to writers, educators, and cultural practitioners, and offer a platform to individuals and groups in the cultural and academic fraternities. I should say communities, not fraternities. Let me correct myself. My own gains from the forum comprised a wealth of learning, because in such a forum it was possible to have multiple conversations. I could learn what it really means to live in a multilingual country. Multiple riches, but also multiple axes of inequality. Of these axes, I want to focus today principally on one old wound: caste. Inevitably, to some extent, gender. And since language is the stuff of reading and writing, and since languages make up our multilingual world, we will keep translation in the picture. Translation in the literal sense, of course, but also in the metaphorical sense of translating diversity and difference, translating unheard or ignored voices, languages, histories, and narratives that recount both personal life stories as well as stories of the community. Let me share just 3 of these powerful learning experiences with you. The life and work of the Tamil writer and teacher Bama, the Telugu writer Guram Joshua via his translator, historian and teacher Chinnaya Jangam, and the Kannada writer and teacher Aravind Malagatti. First, Bama Faustina Susairaj, better known as Bama. Reading Bama means learning what it is to be cut by the system, but also hearing the call to cut through the system. The system referred to here is, of course, caste, with the patriarchy hovering in the background like a grim shadow. There is also the anxiety of another's gaze and the power of this powerful other to label one's caste and community as inferior. Bama's first book, the autobiographical Karukku, was published in Tamil in 1992 and in an English translation by Lakshmi Holmstrom in 2000. In her introduction to the published translation, Lakshmi writes that the book grows out of a particular moment, a personal crisis and watershed in the author's life, which drives her to make sense of her life as woman, Christian, Dalit. And summing up her take on the writer's purpose and the challenge, as well as the promise it holds out to the reader, Lakshmi adds, Bama is writing in order to change hearts and minds. And as readers of her work, we are asked for nothing less than an imaginative entry into that different world of experience and its political struggle. A different world of experience, plain old struggle, individual and collective. Then a lifetime of political struggle. And an invitation to extend a hand of solidarity. All this I read and saw and heard in Karaku. My learning deepened over the years with Bama's other work as writer, teacher, thinker. Karaku describes the place where Bama grew up, a village in Tamil Nadu with beautiful mountains, tanks, fields, and woods. But this is not just nature. It is part of the hard business of making a living. Moreover, the place and every aspect of life in it is sharply classified and divided, caste mapped. One caste climbs Palmyra palms for a living, another sweeps streets, others work with leather, still others make earthenware pots, and Bama's own community, the Parayas, are agricultural labourers. Bama writes that the upper caste communities kept themselves to their part of the village and we stayed in ours. We only went to their side if we had work to do there. But they never ever came to our parts. The post office, the panchayat board, the milk depot, the big shops, the church, the schools, all these stood in their streets. So why would they need to come to our area? By the time Bama completed the 8th class in her village and went to high school in a neighbouring town, she knew very well what untouchability was. It meant being the children of servants, of cheap labour. It meant her old grandmother calling a little boy Ayya and obeying his commands. It meant cupping hands to receive drinking water poured from a height of 4 feet. And it meant being taunted on the streets or in school as a pariah. Even a child knew what it was to be thought of as contemptible, as a Harijan. Bama studied hard, but no achievement in school or college would change what she was in the eyes of the teachers or the hostel warden or the people in the bus. Even if she got the best marks in class, even if she was determined to earn respect, she was only a pariah. Perhaps it was this growing realization that she would never transcend this identity that made her embrace it, not with resignation, but with a new zeal. She decided to become a nun so that she could teach Dalit children without the prejudice that was part of their experience in school. Bama hoped to teach in a village school, but the religious order had other plans for her. After 7 years in a world unlike the real world she grew up in, the real world she hoped to change, Bama left the convent only to find she did not know how to live. It was this terrible period of isolation that forced her into doing something that helped her to survive. She began to write about her childhood, about being Dalit. She wrote about a culture of survival, the hard work, the sounds of songs or quarrels. She had the women speaking in the earthy language they actually spoke in, the only armor these women have against both landlords and husbands. She wrote in the dialect she had grown up speaking. She called the story of a Dalit life Karaku, a double-edged reference to the stem of the palm leaf. The serrated edges of the leaf recalled for Bama not only the social cuts people like her got every day, but also the more important fact that they had to cut through this stifling system. The book, when finally published, caused a furor. Her own people were furious with her that they had been shown as ugly. She was not allowed to enter her village for almost 7 months. Then understanding grew, particularly among the young, and she was invited to the village when an Ambedkar statue was erected. Among the literary orthodoxy, there was, predictably, some discomfort about the subject matter of her writing and her language, which was criticized as neither beautiful nor acceptable. But she made many others proud. In the succeeding years, though she was often lonely, often tired of presenting a tough exterior, Bama managed to do the unthinkable. She got herself a job as a school teacher. She took a loan and built a small house where she learned to live alone. She wrote more, stories of breakthroughs people made so that they would not be broken themselves. Bama was a school teacher for 35 years from 1979 to 2015. She recalls the ways in which inequalities persist in the education system. The education system, this is in her words, the education system does not care for an egalitarian society or social justice. Instead of changing the existing unequal system, it justifies it. Educational institutions that should be independent are becoming factories to simply mint money. Religion, caste, language, and color are used to decimate the lives of students who fight for social justice. When economically depressed Dalits struggle to reach the threshold of higher education, they're mentally tormented, their thoughts and emotions deliberately killed. But Bama also has a message of hope. She says, teachers can do wonders if they commit themselves to shaping the future generation. She also adds that she's not alone, which is a source of great optimism. There are other Dalit hearts like mine with a passionate desire to create a new society made up of justice, equality, and love. They who have been the oppressed, are now themselves, like the double-edged karaka, challenging their oppressors. When she told me, cut through the system instead of cutting ourselves, she explained how this could be done, by women, for instance. Dalit women, vulnerable on the 3 levels of caste, gender, and class, must build, said Bama, on the collective strength of community living to resist exploitation. Indeed, Bama's manifesto for action applies to all those who have been, she says, enslaved for generation upon generation and been told again and again of their degradation. We must dare to stand up for change, she says. We must crush all those institutions that use caste to bully us into submission and demonstrate that among human beings there are none who are high or low. It is we who have to explain to people where they belong and bring about a changed society. There's a postscript here, which is that not long ago, one of Bama's texts, Sangati, which broadly means messages, was dropped from the Delhi University syllabus. I suggest you find out more about that. So with Bama as teacher, I learned about caste, about women, about language and education. My second conversation was, again, a learning experience on multiple levels, from the Dalit role and aspiration during the freedom movement, to challenging the literary canon, to the role of politics in literary translation. And always, always education. Guram Joshua, that is 1895 to 1971, wrote poetry that invigorated classical Telugu with the language of the people. He also took on significant real-life themes, imagining the nation and making a plea for equality. His commitment to giving voice to the poor and the marginalized in general, and to the Dalit in particular, grew out of his own experience of discrimination. Joshua's mother, Lingamamba, was an untouchable Madiga, traditionally associated with tannery and leatherwork, and today agricultural labor. Lingamamba went to a school established by the American Baptist Mission and met Veerayya of the touchable Golla caste. They fell in love. Madiga and Shudra shed their caste and got married as converted Christians. Their son, Joshua, was born out of what should have been a wonderful disruption of caste and religious barriers. But it's not easy to break through the walls of a rigid society. There were 2 gurus in my life, Joshua said. Poverty first, then caste and religious discrimination. Poverty taught him patience, and the rest, the day-to-day prejudice and cruelty, taught him to revolt. Victimhood was never his theme. My knife is a pen, he said. His work was very much a part of his life as part of anti-caste and anti-colonial resistance. Joshua lived in times when wars were being fought in the larger world, when new ideas such as Marxism were enriching the Telugu literary imagination, and when India was fighting its way to becoming a free nation. The ideas and events of the time fed Joshua's view of people whose shoulders bore a great deal of oppressive weight, of work, of poverty, injustice. Yet they fought, whether it was for a country free of colonial rule or for a home of their dreams, a genuinely free country. And so did Joshua. That was then, we wish we could say. But Joshua's agenda is startlingly and sadly relevant in our own times with the persistence of exclusionary fault lines. I will not be bound by caste and religious lines, Joshua said. I'm a universal human being. What resonance these brave lines have for us today, for citizens and movements who are witness to old and new manifestations of caste in 21st century India, along with discrimination on the basis of class, community, gender, and sexuality. It is in such a context, in our times of rampant exclusionary politics, that I discovered Guram Joshua through the English translation of his long poem, Gabbilam. If it was painful for me to have my ignorance about both Joshua and Gabbilam hit me like a punishing slap on the face, it was perhaps even worse to read of the translator's experience. Chinnaya Jangam, a historian whose areas of research cover Dalit studies, caste and social and intellectual history, describes his encounter with Guram Joshua's work. His description is an indictment of the prejudices and erasures of our education system. Jangam says, Guram Joshua was the only Dalit poet I read in school, as a few stanzas from his writings were included in Telugu textbooks. While teaching, teachers always reminded us that Joshua was a Madiga untouchable and still wrote excellent poetry. Given the Brahminical nature of the Telugu curriculum, references to Joshua faded away from the syllabus as I moved up in my studies. But, says Chinnaya, Joshua's poems were sung by Dalit performers. His words were heard in the fields. Joshua had become, just as he described himself, a people's poet. Luckily for us, Chinnaya was encouraged by friends and teachers to engage with Joshua's work in depth and with translating the extraordinary poem Gabbilam. I must add here that some of these friends were in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Over the years, Jangam discovered afresh how unique Joshua the poet and intellectual was, especially in the context of anti-colonial nationalism and the growing political assertion among Dalits. He worked on the translation for more than 10 years. He learned that translation has its own politics, intended or otherwise. As he grew close to the text of Gabbilam, he found some of the existing translations toned down the anger and the radical message of the poem, sometimes by eroding the immediacy of the voice, sometimes by overshadowing the spirit of resistance and focusing on evoking pity. What is Gabbilam? It's a long poem divided into two parts. Each part begins with a preface by Joshua. In part one, entitled An Untouchable Odyssey, a bat enters the dark and miserable house of a Dalit. The Dalit protagonist asks the bat to carry the story of his suffering to Shiva in Kailasa. He also describes the route to Kailasa in the Himalayas, so that the two narratives unfold simultaneously as if reality must be viewed on a split screen. One narrative describes the country's history and its physical and cultural beauties. The parallel narrative gives voice to the suffering of those who have toiled for the country. In the translation, Joshua says, "Without his labor, even the crops hesitate to grow. By sweating day and night, he feeds the world but has nothing to eat." At the end of part 1, the bat sets off for Kailasa, and the untouchable laborer tied his loincloth and readied himself for work in the field. Part 2, Meditation on Freedom, takes us to 1946. The country stands at the threshold of freedom. But what is this free country to be like? Will the Dalit find his rightful place there? What share does each community get in independent India? On the one hand, there is heady hope. Brother Harijan, do not be afraid. The chariot of independence is here. You will have a place in it. Come along to pull it forward. Mother India welcomes you to join in her songs. On the other hand, the monstrous reality of caste still looms everywhere, every day. Joshua asks in the tragic voice of his hero, "Which holy man let me be born into this unkind world?" But can such a life, whether that of the hero of Gabilam or Joshua's, or the reader with a conscience, continue without resistance? The poet's preface ends with a call to keep up the good fight. His efforts will be realized, if not today, tomorrow. Indeed, Gabilam sets out to convince the reader in multiple ways that poetry and protest live in exactly the same place. First, Joshua used the Sanskrit meter in classical Telugu to prove himself equal to Brahmin Pandits. But the tradition of classical verse is turned on its head, so it lives and breathes the Dalit experience. In his preface, Joshua says, "I write this text by keeping Kalidasa's Meghaduta in mind and chose Gabilam, the bat, as the title. For some readers, it might sound harsh. The protagonist in Meghdut sends a message of love. My protagonist sends a searing, poignant message. The protagonist in Meghdut was sentenced to 1 year, but my hero was sentenced from birth, for generations without any end. The hero in Meghdut was a Hindu Cupid suffering from a burning desire to meet his lover. My hero is a victim of poverty that burns his stomach. Unlike the noble kings, exquisite birds like swans and parrots cannot become his messenger. That is why I chose a regular visitor to the homes of the despised, a bat, as his messenger." Thus Joshua challenges the literary canon, the cultural canon, by choosing the bat to travel across the country as the peripatetic messenger of Dalits to speak of their status as untouchable. The bat, Gabilam in Telugu, is believed to be neither bird nor animal, hence a bad omen. Thus he subverts Kalidasa's classic Meghdut. Rather than the elegant messengers used by Savarnas, swans, parrots, peacocks, or clouds, he uses the stigmatized bat that hangs upside down in temple towers to send his message of suffering to the god Shiva. He says, "When you hang upside down inside the temple, you will be closer to the ear of the god Shiva. Make sure the priest is not around when you recount the story of my life." Such a message is usually beyond the pale of officially sanctioned poetry, history, and religion. But in Gabilam, the message, the reality of caste, seizes the stage of the classical literary form for its unfolding of Dalit life. Not surprisingly, Chinnaya Jangam chooses a Dalit epic as the subtitle for his translation of Gabilam. It is, he says, one of the first texts in dialogue with Dalits, but also with mainstream society. Such a dialogue is especially important in the context of anti-colonial nationalism, when each community is thinking about their place within the nation. It locates Dalits as part and parcel of the nation, strengthening the sharp questions it asks and the aspirations it expresses on behalf of Dalits. Let me move to the third and last teacher of the day, Aravind Malagatti. On October 11, 2015, Aravind Malagatti resigned from the Sahitya Academy General Council, saying, "I have resigned condemning the killing of Kalburgi and the silence of the Academy over the issue. It should have spoken out and expressed its condemnation against such acts." His letter to the President of the Academy was forthright. Dr. M.M. Kalburgi's assassination is a clear attack on freedom of expression. Defending freedom of expression must be the Academy's priority. This was my introduction to Malagatti. The moment it now occurs to me was apposite. Since then, I have read his work in English translation, and I understand the unsaid behind that statement he made in 2015. His work is rooted in protest, literary, social, and political protest, all born of the actual experience of discrimination. But by no means is this lived tale aimed at evoking pity or even sympathy. The work serves as a mirror to the conscience, that of the writer, spurring him to tell the truth about the persistence of caste, whether in obvious or less visible forms. It mirrors, in equal if not greater measure, the conscience of the reader, the citizen who lives in a country put together with a constitution that promises equality to all its people. Malagatti's autobiography, Dalit Brahmana, is a series of simply told vignettes about a life, but also a community. It is not the life story of a person, he says. Rather, it is the story of a community. Simply told requires careful explanation. There is nothing naive about these memories, whether of the child or their man or the literary account. But clearly there is no need to embroider them or indulge in verbal gymnastics. The stories of the man, the community, and communities tightly held in the closed fist of caste. If these stories jump off the page and scream at you, it is the kind of scream that is even more awful because it has been quietened for so long and still quietened so often and so easily. There are two comments Malagatti makes about the autobiography that are painfully eloquent about how deep-rooted casteism is in our lives, past and present. Speaking of the differences among castes that become part of received wisdom, tradition, and social norms, Malagatti remarks that even our mythological stories and folklore justify these differences. As illustration, he relates the folk story he had in mind when writing about sacrificing a buffalo before goddess Maramma. The story is about an intercaste marriage. A Dalit boy marries a Brahmin girl. He has convinced her that he is Brahmin. Once they are married, she finds out that he's not. She kills him and he becomes a buffalo. The practice of sacrificing the buffalo to goddess Maramma remains, says Malagatti. What we face in our life is reflected in folk stories as well as our mythological stories. Our Dalit life stories talk about the present status of our lives, and it is our history, the history of India, that is passed on through our life stories. Again, speaking of this title, Dalit Brahmana, government Brahmana, Malagatti describes how he would be teased for being a beneficiary of reservations. They used to tease us and say, in the government's view, we are not Brahmins, you are Brahmins. But Malagatti subverts this mockery, and in the time-tested tradition of dignity politics, he uses the same word as a symbol of self-respect. Let me sum up our brief look at Malagatti's life and work with his telling description of the India he aspires to. This is an India he can see through Ambedkar's spectacles, but also an India with Gandhi's walking stick at the border, gentle guard of the country. Having heard a little of these lives, their texts, their vision of the divisions in India, as well as their aspirations for Indian lives, what are some tentative conclusions we can reach? Or if conclusions are too ambitious, what are some questions we can raise? First, we have seen how in the case of those affected by the day-to-day inequities of the caste system, the autobiography of an individual and a community serves as the meeting point of literary and political expression. There's a question or two we can raise here. Is it possible to be just a writer, distanced from the real world? Is it possible to be a reader, or a student, or a teacher, or indeed a citizen in an imaginary place, a literary vacuum? If not, can we conclude that we have to view both reader and writer as political beings? Like many thoughtful writers who ask themselves exactly what they are doing in public space, or why they need to take a political stand, Nayanthara Sehgal says in an essay called "We All Belong to the Country of Imagination," writing is a political activity in the sense that imagination reacts and responds to, for or against, the atmosphere of its time. Plays and poems and novels are not about politics, but they are the products of their times, and often of politically conscious imaginations. It is the engagement of writers with their times that has made for unforgettable fiction. So, literature is one stream of knowledge. It shows us variations of the knowledge-seeking process, situated in the imagined but real context of reality. Now that we've come to knowledge, the sea into which all human endeavor flows, let us recall that the most important component of the knowledge-seeking process is the question mark. As another wise teacher, Romila Thapar, tells us, knowledge is the process of asking questions of existing knowledge so as to create new knowledge. What does such a process require? Doubt, debate, in short, free speech. And when free speech is threatened? I want to end by sharing with you my response when the magazine Frontline recently asked me what challenge the writer faces today. What happens when words are twisted and made to mean something else? Words like nation or history, citizens or people, the words become strangers to themselves. The souls of these words, the ideas deep inside them, are wounded. The word that lies, the word that panders to the whims of the powerful, challenged the writer on her home ground. But this challenge is only half the story. The other half shines with hope. It says, words can still chase truth. Words can help in the search for justice and equality. This hope takes the writer by the hand. It helps her look hard at the world, at those arrogant with power, and always, always at those whose voices go unheard. Hope makes the writer ask questions, even if she is afraid. But the writer, even when lonely, is not alone. The writer, reader, and citizen live in the same place. They face the challenge together. They can claim what is rightfully theirs. Words and ideas, whether these are thought, dreamt, spoken, sung, read, or written. Books, music, films, dance, theatre, life in classrooms, courts, homes, and on the streets. They belong to us, to you and me. They belong to the good fight we can only fight together.